Well, hello, friends, and welcome. Those of you who are present here with me at Chapel by the Sea on Fort Myers Beach, Florida. Those of you joining us online, thank you for tuning in. It's a pleasure to have you. I'm getting used to this split audience, the hybrid forms of church and Bible study. But we are here to begin our study on, what do I do with it? The Bible for Dummies. And I'm not going to go exactly through the book, but we're going to follow it pretty closely. So as we move forward, we'll be looking at the big picture. We're putting a frame around the painting, if you will. So we get the flow, the story of what we're dealing with. In Heroes, Scoundrels, and Kings, back last year, we looked at some of the individuals. Here, we're going to look at the narrative. What happens? What's the story flow? And since this is session one, it's just the origin and the contents of the Bible to start with. And the thing to remember is, when we're looking at the Bible, we're looking at a long piece of history. The Old Testament, with its 39 books, are the Hebrew scriptures, and that's all before Jesus. The New Testament is Jesus and later. But here's the thing. If you take the Old Testament and you start it over here in Genesis, that's prehistory. You're going to come all the way up here before you begin things like Abraham. Abraham's about 1800 BC. King David's about 1000 BC. In 400 BC, the Old Testament stops and we enter the intertestamental period. So Jesus and the church are this little piece right here, just for perspective. All that is prehistory, the Old Testament, the intertestamental period. But all of that is to prepare for this piece over here with Jesus. So when we look at the Old Testament, we're going to find that everything is blocked together. It's like you go into the library and history is over here, science is over here, biology is over there. That's the way the Bible's organized. It's not chronological. So first you get the law. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Yes, there's history, there's stories in here, but primarily it's spoken of as the law. 5 books. So the classic term for it is the Pentateuch, 5 books. And the Jews refer to it as the Torah. So when you hear these terms thrown around, or if they're used in the book, that's where it comes from. So the first block is the law. Second block is a bunch of history. And they just come one right after the other. So you've got Joshua, Judges. Joshua follows Exodus. And Judges comes after the period of the conquest with Joshua. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. So there's your history block. Now we move into the next pile, and this is poetry and wisdom literature. And that is Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. Each of them has their own bent. We'll talk more about them as we go along. And that's followed by the prophets. There's the major prophets and there's the minor prophets. And the difference is major prophets are longer. That's it. They're all significant. The major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Lamentations is kind of a reflections by Jeremiah, so they're connected. But those are your majors, and they're the big books in the Old Testament. Then you're followed by the minor prophets. And they are Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. They're the mouthful. They're the ones you have to really put your mind to. Each of them has a different emphasis. Each of them has a different focus. But each of them is significant in its own right. Now, at the end of Malachi, the Old Testament stops. Now, there's another group of books we refer to as the Apocrypha. I'm not going to cover those. But they're written between 400 and the birth of Jesus. And they're going to include history, law, poetry, philosophy, and an apocalypse as well. But they're much shorter. But there is the story of the Maccabean revolt and all the wars with the Greeks, between the Greeks and the Jews. That's all recorded in the books of Maccabees, and they're included in this intertestamental literature known as the Apocrypha. So when we get to the New Testament, the same pattern follows. And the first thing you get are the Gospels. This is the stories of Jesus. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we refer to as synoptic gospels because they tell a chronological story. They start with the birth or the beginning of his ministry. They go through to his death and resurrection. John is more philosophical in his bent. He's going to cover that same material, but his is not a chronology. His is more of a reflection and the passion stories, the crucifixion and resurrection. Next up, you get the history. And this is the history of the church, the Acts of the Apostles. And this is where we find from the time of the ascension of Jesus into heaven, the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, all the way through to Paul's the gospel reaching all the way to Rome, the center of the empire, the center of the ancient world. And that's where that ends. Next comes the letters written by these guys. So first are Paul's epistles, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. Now, these are not chronological. It's very logical how these are arranged. The longest letter is first and the shortest letter is last. That's literally how this arrangement was arrived at. So Romans is the longest of Paul's letters. Next is another group of letters we call the general epistles. And these are written not by Paul, but by other authors. So we get Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Jude. And finally, the last book of the Bible is the Apocalypse of St. John, the revelation of St. John the Divine. So that's how it's laid out in our usage. But remember, when it started out, it didn't start out that way. It was all written on scrolls and later on codices. The scrolls were originally written on sheepskin. And if you look carefully, you can see the stitching in this picture. They are sewn together and then they're rolled up and stored in a rack, like you would blueprints, in a little cubby holes. Later, they were, the sequence was fixed, but while they were in this form, there's no set order. You just go over and grab it and, oh, that's Isaiah. Yeah, we'll read that today kind of thing. Later, when the Codex develops about the beginning of the 2nd century, you find they're made from, we say papyrus, others say papyrus. If you say papyrus, you understand where we get the word paper. But now when you start sewing these things together, they're always in the same sequence. So gradually a fixed order evolves, and that's what we have today. Now, when were they written? The Old Testament was written from about 1450 to 400. So remember I said Abraham is about 1800. So about 1450, they start writing down the oral tradition, and we have it preserved. The New Testament is all written between, probably the earliest would be about 42 and ends at around 90 AD with the revelation of St. John. So when was it written? Dates of writing. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, but then it was translated into Greek because Greek was the common language before Latin, it was Greek. And so about 275 BC, the Hebrew was translated into Greek, and it was known as the Septuagint, from the Latin term for 70. And there's all kinds of speculation why it's called that. Doesn't matter. Just know that the Greek Old Testament is referred to as the Septuagint and abbreviated with the Roman numerals for 70. Now, the New Testament is written entirely in Greek. And as a seminary student, we had to master Greek and Hebrew. That was for some of my friends, when they hit Hebrew and started writing from right to left, oh, it was like they found their second home. And for me, it was drudgery. I just barely squeaked through Hebrew. Greek, I had to take 3 times, but I passed it and used it for many years in my work. But it was a challenge, and I can pick up the Greek New Testament and still read much of it. I have to keep my dictionary handy, though. But Hebrew, it's just arcane knowledge, it's kind of way in the back of my head now. Okay, so the Bible is a religious history. It is not science. It's not journalism like we think of it today. And it's important to keep that in mind because it's the story of God's love of his creation. And how God uses the Jews to restore a personal relationship with his people, namely everyone, not just the Jews, everyone. And it's a sacred history that discloses God's self-revelation to within history, to humanity. And because we'll see in a moment when at the fall in Genesis 3, that relationship is broken between God and mankind. So God begins at that point restoring that. And he works in his own time and pace. It's a record of the past, but it's also a plan for the future. And with that in mind, one of the big questions that keeps coming up is, can we trust these documents? And you're taking an oral tradition from 3,800 years ago, and you're saying, this is true. How do you know? I'm glad you asked. In 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the mountains around an old settlement known as Qumran, down by the Dead Sea. A Bedouin shepherd was looking for some lost goats, and he was looking through these caves, and he threw some rocks down into a cave to see if there were any goats in there. And he heard pottery breaking. So he went inside and he found some scrolls. So he took them to the local souk, the local market, and he sold them. Well, very quickly, they moved through the system to the directors of the antiquities in what was then Palestine. And in the aftermath, they went back and discovered that among these scrolls was every book of the Old Testament except the book of Esther. These jars contained the scrolls. There was a community called the Essenes, an extreme conservative sect of Judaism, living at Qumran by the Dead Sea. And during the Jewish wars with the Romans, I think this was one in 112 BC, AD, they put their sacred documents in these jars and sealed them up and hid them in the caves so the Romans wouldn't get them. And then the Essene community was wiped out. So they sat there until 1947. Upon opening them, it was astounding what they found, because they took the oldest text, complete text of the Old Testament at that point was from 500 AD. And among these scrolls, there was a complete text of the scroll of Isaiah that was carbon dated at 300 BC. So now you have a block of 800 years between that copy and this copy. These things are copied by hand, every one of them. When these scribes would copy these things, the scribe would be given the original and the sheepskin, and he'd copy them. He would not read it. He would copy it letter by letter. So when he's done, it's handed to a reader. No, it's handed to the counter. And the counter takes the original and the copy, and he counts every letter. And if they do not match exactly, the copy's thrown out. It's destroyed, maybe 2 weeks of work. When I was in the Bahamas, the marriage registry office was a disaster. And everything was recorded on these big sheets of paper, handwritten, and then they were glued to a page in these giant books and stored. Big red leather bound volumes all around the registrar's office. One day I went in to get a couple had asked me to go get a copy of their marriage license because it was months coming. And so they said, well, everybody's busy, but if you want to copy it, hand copied yourself, we'll let you do that. I said, fine. So they give me the paper and I start copying, and they take it to the registrar general, and she rejects it. It's not an exact copy. What do you mean? Well, it's in the original, you wrote street, S-T-R-E-E-T, and on the copy, you wrote S-T period. So you got to do it over. 5 copies later, I got it right. It was worse in handwriting class in 3rd grade. But these guys, after it was counted, then the readers would read it, and after it was approved, they would be sewed together. So there was a lot of labor in every one of these scrolls. And after 800 years, those 2 copies were virtually identical. I mean, a dot here and a T there, but that was it. There was no substantive change. So we know that these things are accurate, and they're precise, and we can rely upon them. And from that, we extrapolate that whatever is here is the most accurate it can be. Now, it's not what we think of as court records or science, but it is an accurate record of what was going on. Why was the Bible written? Well, first of all, as an instrument of conversion. It's a means of redemption to bring us back to God. God is really concerned that this relationship with us has been severed, broken by sin. And so he's providing us the Bible as the means to get to know him and to come back to that relationship that he had with Adam and Eve in the beginning. So it leads us to faith in Jesus Christ. It's there to build mature Christian character. And it's so we can live in the power of the good news in a world of bad news. That's true today. So in other words, it's a source of hope for us. And we keep going back to it because it inspires us, it comforts us, it refreshes us. The whole point of, I said, reading Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount, that's a way of restoring hope, clarifying our minds and getting our heads out of all the bad news circulating around and listening to God's message to us, because God has a lot to say. So Genesis 1 through 11, that's where we're going to focus the rest of this time. This is stories about God and humanity. It's not science or history. It's poetry, allegory, symbol, figures of speech, and other literary devices. And it's a product of a Bedouin culture from 4,000 years ago, coming down to us. And with Adam and Eve, God is known face to face. And after the fall, God completes the revelation by coming to us in the form of Jesus Christ. So it's all about getting from there to here through Jesus. Now, in the beginning, we find out that God is the cause and the reason, and the story is characterized by sequence and progression. So one flows into the other. And we can see this in Genesis 1, in the first creation account, because everything flows in sequence. Day 1, he creates light and darkness. Day 2, the firmament is set apart, sky, air, water. Day 3, land and water and vegetation appear. Day 4, the heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, the seasons, days, and years are created. Day 5, all the living creatures, sea creatures first, and then birds. Day 6 come mammals, then humans, male and female. And then day 7, the Sabbath, he rests. So it's traditionally, humans were spoken of as the crown of creation. That was a classic Victorian phrase because we were the pinnacle of God's creation. Genesis 2 gives us the story of the Garden of Eden. And here we find a descriptive, first chapter is descriptive, but in the second, it's lyrical. It's almost poetic, the way the story is presented to us. Neither of them is intended to be literal. I have a really hard time with this idea of 6 days, what do we call it, 6,000-year-old Earth? Yeah, the idea that everything happened before 3000 BC. Everything happened, after 3000 BC. The entire creation was made after 3000 BC. How do you get that number? I forget. In one of the other classes, I gave the exact date and time that is perceived. Well, they counted back all the generations. So-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so and lived this long. They counted the number of generations and rolled the time back and said, that must have been here. Well, that was done in 1542 by James Ussher, who was the Bishop of Armagh, Ireland at the time. Now, you and I do not use the science of 1542. We don't use the medicine of 1542. We don't use there was no calculus or algebra at that point. We have progressed in all of our scientific and our medicine knowledge. And we've progressed in our knowledge about the Bible as well. And that's why I say, don't lock into a 6-day creation, 6-day world. No, this is a description of how God works. It's not a science text, and it's not a history text. It's a religious text telling us how God creates and how God loves us. One person said, science, it's a difference between building a house and building a home. The architect in science tells you how to build the house. You put these pieces together and it'll stay up. But when it comes to building a home, that's building relationships. And that's what the Bible's talking about. It's teaching us how to build a home, a relationship with God. So all the names in this story have meaning. So the Garden of Eden means the Garden of Delight. Adam means of the ground. Eve means the mother of all living. Now, if you in Genesis, where did my Bible go? In Genesis 2, it talks about the Garden of Eden and the 4 rivers that flow out of the garden. Where'd it go? Here it is. A river flows out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divides and becomes 4 branches. The name of the first is Pishon. The second is Havilah. The third is Tigris. And the fourth is Euphrates, or as my British friends call it, Euphrates. Each of them has a particular meaning in the story. Adam is formed from the Adamah to become a man, and God breathes life into him. God plants a garden in Eden in the east, and he makes every plant grow. And the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life are planted in the center. 4 rivers flow out: Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates. And this is the literal Tigris and Euphrates in Iraq today. We're going to find out that Abraham's going to come from modern day Basra, down here at Basra, in Ur of the Chaldees. But the 4 rivers, Pishon means freely flowing, Gihon means stream, Tigris means rapid, and Euphrates, or Euphrates, means sweet water. And all through these stories, if you could read Hebrew, you would see more than just the name. You'd see the meaning, the unintended meaning. They are told to till and keep the garden. So they are responsible for maintaining it. And they are to eat of every plant except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So God looks at man and says, you know, it's not good that man's alone. He should have some companions. So he creates all the animals from the same dust. And what do we know from science? We're all carbon-based creatures. And man names them, but none of them is found to be a suitable helper. So God does something about it. He takes the rib from the man, and from him he creates woman. And it says in the scripture, she shall be called Isha because she was taken out of Ish. And that's what the scripture says, the man and the woman, but they end up being named Adam and Eve. And we're told they are naked and not ashamed. There's a place of innocence here. So the first sin is the next part of the story. And it leads me to ask, what was one area that was off limits to you when you were kids? That you weren't allowed to touch or go to, or
my parents had a locked closet and you couldn't know what was behind.
The locked closet. We had one of those in my dorm my freshman year in college. And one night we were standing around bored, and it was a double-doored closet with a padlock on it. And it was like a 8 or 10-foot door. And one of the guys said, I wonder what's in that closet. So all these 18, 19-year-old minds go crazy. I pulled out my penknife and used that as a wedge, took off my loafer and used that as a hammer, and drove the hinge pins out of the hinge. Then 2 of the guys grabbed hold of the door and pulled it back. And I peeked in and fell down on the floor laughing. The only thing in the closet was a little index card taped to a shelf, and it said, well, was it worth it? So we wrote on it, yes, put it up and put the door back in place. But that's a good example. You know, you're not allowed in here. Well, that's kind of what we get in this story. Or are there creatures that scare you, that skeeve you? Snakes, yeah. I got to deal with snakes all the time around my yard, but you know, as long as I can see them and they can see me, we're fine. It's when we don't see each other and we both go flying through the air. And I've got a Jamaican guy that does yard work with me, and I can tell when he's encountered a snake because I can hear the scream from the other side of the yard. But there are certain things that we don't like being around them. Some people thrive on playing with snakes. I don't. But the story turns on the Satan coming to them and saying, did God really say? So the question is doubt. And she says, oh, we can eat of everything except the tree in the middle. And Satan says to her, oh, but you won't die if you eat of that. Subtext, God's lying to you. You'll be like God. Ooh, vanity. Knowing good from evil. Now we're coveting. And they take the apple or the fruit. We're not told it's an apple, we're told it's a fruit. And it could have been a pomegranate for all we know. And she tastes it and it's desirable. She gives it to Adam and he eats it and he's, hey, this is good. But then they realize they are naked, they feel shame, and they make clothes for themselves. At this point, the unity with God is turned to enmity. They hide themselves, and when they're found by God, they pass the buck. Adam, what have you done? Have you eaten of the fruit? Oh, the woman gave it to me. And he says to the woman, what have you done? She goes, oh, the serpent gave it to me. Mark Twain said, God's mistake was in forbidding the apple. He should have forbidden the snake. Then they would have eaten the serpent. They passed the buck. And why would they hide from God? Why do you think?
They knew they did wrong.
They knew they did wrong. Yeah, there's a sense of guilt, shame, embarrassment.
Because they didn't yet know in the relationship the forgiving nature of God.
Yeah, they didn't yet know the forgiving nature of God. And we're going to see that. The story is not about sex. The story is about obedience and listening to what God says. And it brings up an important point that we tend to miss in this story. And that is that innocence is not the same as integrity. It's not a matter of you're innocent or not innocent. It's a question of what do you choose? Innocence means you have never had the opportunity to choose. You've never had to make the choice. How do you know you like chocolate? Because you tried it. But if you've never tasted chocolate, what do you know about it? Nothing. You're innocent in that sense. But as soon as you taste it, you have to make a decision. And once you confront the choice, your innocence ends, and we move into the field of integrity or corruption. And with understanding came sorrow and guilt, like you were saying. There's accountability for their actions. This is where the judgment comes. God confronts and judges, and the serpent is cursed, the Satan, the tempter. You shall crawl from now on, you should crawl in the dust on your belly. And I shall put enmity between you and the woman's seed. He will bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. This is taken as the foretaste, the prophecy from God about what's going to happen at the crucifixion. That the seed of the woman, the child of the woman, will crush his head, kill death, and die in the process. That's back in Genesis 3:15. Now, the serpent is cursed. The ground is cursed. It will yield its fruit reluctantly, whereas in the past, it was just bursting forth. Now you're going to have to till the land. You're not going to be able to just pick it up. So let's review that. What does God curse? Serpent and the ground. Now, to the woman, he says, I will greatly increase your pain in childbirth, yet your desire shall be for your husband. Interesting that the Hebrew word that we translate as pain can also be translated as labor. So the woman is not cursed. She's given a sentence, something changes, but she's not cursed. And he says, the man, you shall produce food by the sweat of your brow. It will not be an easy process anymore. So what do you see? After judgment, God is merciful. And God goes further. He makes them garments from animal skins and clothes them. So when I look at this, I see a merciful, patient God who still is maintaining discipline, but he's not slaying them, but he does cast them out of the garden. And sin and death become part of the world with cosmic consequences. So they are sent out of the garden, and God puts an angel with a flaming sword in front of the entrance so they can never return. So they're out of Eden, and they go to a place east of Eden. Ever heard that term? John Steinbeck's. That leads us to Genesis 4 and the story of Cain and Abel. Adam and Eve have two sons, Cain, which means acquisition, and Abel, which means fresh. Now, they get into a contest, a story of jealousy and murder. And when Cain brings a grain sacrifice, God rejects it, and Abel brings an animal sacrifice, and God accepts it. So Cain gets angry at his brother and kills him. In the consequence, God exiles Cain. He doesn't kill him. He doesn't slay him. He exiles him to the land of Nod, a land called Wandering, east of Eden. And he places a mark upon him so no one will slay him. And he goes off, marries, and has children. Adam and Eve conceive a third son, and they name him Seth, which means compensation or sprout. While I was in Alaska, my third son was born prematurely and died after 11 days. And the people of the town and the church surrounded us and helped us through that. It was a real rough time. 2 years later, a couple in the Forest Service had a child born, was stillborn? Anyway, they lost a child. It was either stillborn or died after 2 days, very, very quickly after birth. And I went over to see them, and I told them this story. I told them about the third son being named Compensation, Seth. And a year later, she was pregnant again. They flew her down to Virginia so that she would be close to the hospital and family, and she gave birth to a boy. And one of the co-workers said, "Oh, they wanted me to tell you, they named him Seth." This story covers thousands of years. It's not intended to be complete. It's to get us moving on the road to finding God's love and forgiveness. So the line of Cain continues to Lamech, but that is unrecognized by God. God follows the line of Seth. He says that's where the line is blessed. So we find music and the arts developing as we go through the story. Metallurgy begins, iron and bronze. And we find the beginning of urban society. These are all described in 1 through 11. Now, we said in Heroes, Scoundrels, and Kings, when you look at this, we can date when the Bronze Age begins and ends. We can date when the Iron Age begins and ends. The Iron Age is right around 14 to 1200 BC. And the Bronze goes back to about 3000 BC. So in the text are clues to when all this takes place, and it's real. When does music and the arts develop? When does urban society develop? These are going to all go together at roughly the same time. So there's a lot more information there than initially meets the eye. You have to look at it carefully and read the clues that are there to tell you what's happening. This is followed by the story of the flood. Humanity is evil and they turn away from God, and Noah is the one who finds favor with God and becomes the means of salvation for all of life. And with his family, they construct the ark and they live in it for 1 year. You talk about a lockdown. We can identify with this after the past 2 years. But here's the thing, the ark is not what's important. If you go to someplace up in Kentucky, they've got a full-size model, 300 or 600, 300 cubits, 450 feet long, complete ark museum, all telling us how everything was created at this point. That's not what's important. What's important is humanity starts over after the deluge, and God is there sponsoring them, making it happen. He establishes a covenant with Noah and his sons. And the rainbow, which was a symbol was the rain god's war bow in the sky that he was going to use to attack them, now becomes a sign of God's faithfulness, the sign of his covenant. And the nations of the world are traced through Noah's sons, Japheth, Ham, and Shem. And Shem, it gives birth to Nahor, and it goes down to Terah, and Terah gives birth to a guy named Abram, his father to a guy named Abram. Now, these are not direct lines. These are the big names in the genealogy, because there's a long time between the flood and Terah. Terah and Abram dwell in Ur of the Chaldees in modern day Babylon. They're down here near the Basra area. And what are the two rivers? The Tigris and the Euphrates flowing down there. We're going to see that the story goes all the way back across the Fertile Crescent to the other side. So that's where we're going to pick up next with the patriarchs. So if you read chapters 5 and 6 in Bible for Dummies, you'll get a nice summary overview of it. And in the scriptures, read the rest of Genesis 12 through 50. Or if you want, you can skim the cliff notes. That's okay. But there's a lot of stories in here. There's a lot of information. And we're going to take a look at that next week. So this is the Bible for Dummies. And it's a look at how God, the relationship between God and his world and us, the people of this world. So what questions do you have? What comments? Yeah.
I'm kind of struck by, from the very beginning with Adam and Eve, the whole notion of judgment, God's judgment. Who's evil? Who's good?
Mm-hmm.
Who's blessed?
Who's cursed?
Who's cursed? And are those deeds that are of the man, or are those judgments of God? In other words, as people, presumably in that similar situation, we are told that we live by grace of God,
Mm-hmm.
that he knows our hearts.
We live by and are saved by grace.
Right. But it just seems like with this, I don't know if man is just always messing up.
Yeah.
And that's their natural way, or if God knows people's hearts, and that's why he makes this judgment as humankind develops what's blessed and what's cursed.
Well, that's the big dilemma behind all of this. Is it our fault? Did God know that the serpent? Did God know that Satan would tempt them when he created it? I don't know. That's one of the things where we have to leave that. That's one of the questions I want to ask God when I get to heaven. I've got a lot of questions. While I was in Alaska, we had a weekly Bible study, and we used to keep a list in one of the members' Bibles of questions we want to ask God. We're up to about 4 pages when on summer leave or something, they lost the list. But there's a lot of unanswered stuff. And that's where we trust. We don't just take it on faith. We trust the God that we know, and keep seeking for answers. Keep seeking for what does God reveal to us in this story. And what am I missing, Lord? It's one of the big prayers that I find I keep coming back to. What are you trying to tell me that I'm not getting?
Yeah. And at times we want to believe he's omniscient.
Yeah.
Omnipotent. We want to believe that. Times when we want someone to take over for us.
Sure.
And at other times we kind of want to say, I got this. I'm good. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I don't know if the relationship is really like that.
Yeah, you can always create a character saying, never mind, God, I got this one. You know, the story about the guy that's driving around the block trying to find a parking place. He says, God, if you help me, hey, I'm late for a job interview. If you help me find a parking place, I'll make church every Sunday. And just then a parking place appears. He pulls in, he goes, never mind, God, I got this. Okay.
Right.
So there's always that temptation to do it ourselves and forget about God. Yeah.
And he wanted to give us our free will to choose him or not to choose him.
Yeah. So he gives us, we have the freedom to choose.
Right.
He didn't make us puppets,
Right.
but he does want our obedience. He wants us to respect and follow the way he sets forth, because his premise is if you live the way I tell you, you're going to have a good life. If you live the way you want to, you're going to have a messed up life
Mhm.
and a lot of pain and heartache in the process.
But do we really have free will? Because then he says, well, there's a right way and there's a wrong way. It's like your toddler, go into your closet, pick anything you want to wear today. But you can't wear that, and you can't wear that,
Yeah. All right. Well, like I say, we'll pick up with the patriarchs next week, and you're going to find that these characters are they're very, very down to earth and earthy and flawed characters, but nonetheless, they're the forefathers of, they're our ancestors in the faith. We carry their spiritual DNA with us. And so it's important that we look at them and see who they are. So the story is going to continue next time here at Chapel by the Sea on Fort Myers Beach with the Bible for Dummies. And we're going to hit number 2 and study the patriarchs. So next time, I'll see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
There it goes.
Really well.